Good day, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Spark Your F.I.R.E podcast. I'm your host, David Shee. And as always, we would love to get some updates on the ground. And we've got our good friend up in Queensland there, Tom Rivera from Property Works, joining us back today. Tom, how are you doing?
Hi, David. Good. Good to be back. It's been a while.
It has been. There's been significant changes, I've got to say, in the last 6 months or so in Queensland. And I think everyone kind of knew that's coming. Like, the Sunshine State's finally getting that sunshine, right? After being abandoned for so long. And it's good that, we're seeing property prices really, really shooting off in Brisbane at the moment. But I think it's just given, with people like us who's not on the ground, it's really difficult to know what's really happening. And, if you look at the core logic data, for example, because that kind of data is always lagging. It's lagging data. It doesn't actually tell you exactly what's happening, right? So, which is why I thought, it'd be good to bring you back on and just to tell our listeners and give us listeners, as a lot of our listeners are invested in Queensland, of course, to see what's really happening on the ground. So, so I think, Tom, to kick it off, mate, really, I think the first thing is, I guess, what everyone is keen to know right now is what is happening in terms of the sales volume, the sales data, and the sales side of things. We're seeing a huge spike of the property prices in Queensland. Like, I think it was about 30% for the last 12 months also, right? Huge jump. Is that still happening at the moment? Like, what are you seeing on inspections or from sales agents?
So the achievable prices are substantially lower than what they were 6 months ago. I suppose everyone was expecting that. No one necessarily knew when that would happen or to what sort of magnitude, but definitely as interest rates go up, the excitement comes out of the market, which is the whole point in the rates going up, so it's working. But definitely the salespeople are indicating that the prices that were there earlier in the year, not there anymore. That being said, let's say you bought something for $300,000 a couple of years ago, maybe a little bit prior to COVID, the last time we had sort of a normal market before it all happened.
Yeah.
And, let's say it's a low set brick in Woodridge, for example. That property might have been worth $550,000 at the absolute height 6 months ago. Probably still worth $500,000 now. So I guess if you bought it 6 months ago, you'd be a little bit stressed. But if you bought it 2 years ago, certainly the majority of my clients obviously have held their properties for some time. They're still pretty happy. But definitely that cooling off effect that the interest rate rises were aiming for is happening. There's less buyers in the market. And I've definitely noticed I've had more clients putting their properties on the market in the last few months. Basically, anyone that's thinking, I want to get out in the next few years, the sales agents, and I tend to agree, are telling them, well, as soon as possible, because it's likely that the prices will continue to reduce before stabilizing. I personally don't think there's a huge amount left for it to go down. There's a lot of crappy news out there saying we're going to go into some gigantic recession. There's no real indicators to suggest that there's going to be some sort of catastrophic collapse. I think we're going to do what other markets have done, like Sydney in the last decade, and it's just going to, it's had a huge spike, it's going to cool off a little, and then it's going to stabilize.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the government tends to go for. That's what the policy over the last decade has pushed for in overheating markets. So every indication, as far as I'm concerned, suggests that that's what we're going to get.
Yeah, right. Okay, now that's interesting. So I guess in a summary, we've gone past the peak and now it's starting to turn, right? And that's evident from the actual like core logic sales data that we're seeing as well, like in terms of the price variations. But what you're suggesting is it only came back a little bit at the moment, or is it just starting to come back right now, essentially, from the peak?
I think it's come back noticeably.
Okay.
It could be 50,000. I guess in bigger markets, it could be even more than that. We're sort of dealing with a more cost-effective market. You might have an agent who specializes in Bulimba or somewhere quite, medium price, well over $1 million, probably proportionately will have come down a little bit. Or sorry, not proportionately in absolute value. But there probably is more to go. I guess the RBA said that they want rates at 3%, so people probably still need to sell a bit more.
Yeah.
But I suppose that there'll come a point where it flattens out. We just haven't got there yet.
Okay. Are you seeing? So I know you're primarily operating in the Logan area, right? So that's what you're seeing. Are you aware any differences in terms of the price pullback, maybe in the northern part of the region, towards Moreton Bay? What about also in the Brisbane City Council region, kind of towards the CBD? Because that around the CBD area is the one that's really have gone up. Heaps during this boom, right? Are they also putting back a lot heavier in comparison to Logan and the northern regions? Do you know much about that?
I probably don't spend enough time in sales areas and talking to salespeople.
Yeah.
My understanding is it's pretty proportionate across the board. Like, you're not having some areas pulling back 10% while other areas only 5%. But it could be that is the case.
Okay.
I guess as a general rule, the higher the value and the more it's growing, the more it would go down as well. So
absolutely,
those areas with the most hype are probably going to see the most correction too.
That's true. No, I think I do agree. It's part of the correction that's going to come, isn't it? And we just don't know. I think we don't know. So for anyone who is wanting to sell, I guess, now, unfortunately, you probably missed the peak now in terms of the sales price, but it's still better off to put it on the market as soon as you can, isn't it? Yeah, to still try to. Okay, which then leads to another question, Tom. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this. From your observation, what type of buyers currently in the market? Is it owner-occupier? Is it investors? What sort of people is looking to buy?
That's a good question. So when the market started to rocket upwards, it was largely first-home buyers and owner-occupiers. I know that because we kept losing managements because people kept moving the properties, which is always annoying, but it's super exciting. Mostly really lovely people, a lot of first-home buyers, and it's always really cool to see someone get into their first home. So it's
absolutely.
We saw as investors started to realize, whoa, prices are going up, so the yields are not so good, say, in Logan anymore. But the capital growth's there, so suddenly I'm interested again. We started getting more investors, higher prices. As it tipped over the last 6 months, I think I don't have a huge sample audience, so I can't really explain it. I feel like I've had a higher proportion of investors back in as it's dropped down, and I guess, your average savvy investor might think, why would I buy now? It's likely to keep dropping. So I'm not entirely sure why. But yeah, quite a few of the properties that have sold recently have gone to people who are continuing them on as investments. And I guess that might, if you spoke to a bigger agency or just a variety of other sources, you may get a different sample size there. But yeah, strangely, more investors seem to be interested right now. I would have thought you'd get more sort of owner occupiers in at the moment, but I suppose it's not really a super attractive time for any given party to buy while prices are falling. So you're probably just getting people who are just ready. They might have been spending the last couple of years getting ready, and they're finally just ready now, and they just want to pull the trigger. And it's not necessarily a particular bias to any group there.
No, that's no. Look, I certainly understand in terms of sample size. Both you and me are probably not qualified to be able to comment more on that side of things. But look, it is. I do agree with you that in this current market, because of the rising interest rate, it's not putting any easier pressure on the first home buyers, or because they were the active ones during the boom, right? They kind of go, this is a record low interest rate. We want to take advantage of what we can at the moment, and basically just get into the market. But now that the interest rate's gone up about 1.75% higher than what they were previously at the record lows, it's proving to be putting a bit of burden in terms of their recalculation. People probably will sit more on the fence to go, should I really jump in now or should I wait a bit more? Plus what you're saying before, prices continue to slide. So they might go, do you know what? Why don't I just kind of like wait for another 3 to 6
Hold
months,
on,
right? Yeah. So I'm going to see what things happen, see what happens by that time. Whereas for investors on the other side of things, it's interesting from what you're saying. The investors are still picking up deals, which is reasonable. I still got investors buying as well, but probably not as much in the Queensland market now for a couple of reasons. One, there's been like I said, last 12 months, 30% increase in terms of the price, and it's now starting to pull back. So a lot of people think that if I jump in now, I'm pretty much buying at the peak price. If I want to jump in, why don't I wait for a bit more, right? In that sense. And number two, the interest rate again is also a part of the consideration. It's curbing that demand, as well as pretty much all the repayment has jumped a lot, especially when you're holding a big portfolio. Like every 0.5% increase in interest rate is obviously hurting your pocket a little bit. And when you times that by 3 or 4 properties at the same time, it's hurting quite a bit. So
definitely for people who are buying at these higher values, an increase from 5 to 6% on a property at 300 grand, I don't know, 5 years ago is one thing. But if you bought that same property at 550 grand 6 months ago, and you've gone from 2 to 3%, that's a lot more money for you. Multiplied over multiple properties. It's funny seeing a lot of people not understanding that dynamic too. The interest rates are very low historically, but the value of the property is massively higher. So the extra interest repayments and the effect of any given basis point rise is multiplied.
Exactly. And as the prices shot up as well, the rental yield doesn't seem as attractive, because that was one of the main factors for people getting into Logan, right? Like, the early days you could easily buy a $300,000 high set, that's to say high set, and you can potentially rent it up to around 500-ish, per week, that type of thing, 450, 500, I don't know, depending on how it's done up, right? Assuming that's dual occupancy. Like that type of yield in comparison to today is, if you have to buy a high set around the 600, but you're still only getting about $500 per week type of rent, doesn't stack up anymore. So so it's interesting though, I guess, from that perspective, because the rental yield doesn't stack up. So I struggle to see why investors will still be buying in Queensland. But having said that, I'm sure people's got their thoughts around the numbers. Do you know why they're still looking in Queensland? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I guess it's a combination of things. Now we have capital growth.
Good.
And I mean, not right now, but over the last couple of years, people have seen Brisbane obviously has always been a bit of a look. It's a big capital city. We're going to expect capital growth at some point. Haven't really had it in a lot of areas, but I think a lot of people are buying in the city or, the regional areas around the city. I think they call like middle ring suburbs, etc. Because there will be capital growth at some point, even if the yield was a bit average. And sort of an average Brisbane yield is still better than an average Sydney yield. As you get further out to the regional areas like Logan, Ipswich, Moreton Bay, the yields compress. And don't get me wrong, the rents have gone up dramatically. But the sales prices were going up further, so the yields were still getting squashed. I guess people were looking at that saying, well, the yields aren't as good as they were, but the capital growth potential is better than it was. So it just forms a different balance of an investment. And it was kind of interesting to see, my home market of Logan, people would buy here thinking, well, it's never going to go anywhere. And if it does, that's cool. But I'm buying it because it's near enough to positively geared. And that changed quite a bit. And funnily, I guess from a classic investor's point of view, it made it more attractive, because whenever I've ever asked anyone, they've said, oh, you never buy for the yield, you buy for the capital growth potential. So I suppose in Queensland as a whole, having capital growth has just made it hugely more popular, even if the yields have moved more towards Sydney ways. I think I heard someone telling me, and you or any viewers can correct me, I think, a 3% yield in Sydney is considered okay. Whereas in Logan, if you weren't getting 5.5 plus, it was a stinky investment. So it's
Pretty
sort of
much.
funny listening to clients and what they pay in Sydney and the rents they get. The yields down there are terrible. Even up here, I still think with our capital growth, our yields are probably still a bit better across
True.
the range. And definitely, we've seen some huge rental increases. My average increase at the moment is probably $90 a week. You know, I've been in the industry since 2012, and I've never seen more than 10 or 20 a week. So it's pretty wild, and I guess that helps start to balance the interest rate rises and the increase in the cost of the properties.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point, Tom. And I'm glad you mentioned about the rent rises because that was going to be my next topic of discussion as well. Because what is happening in terms of the rental market at the moment? I guess you already gave us a bit of hint because of the amount of rent increases that you're able to achieve. Are you still seeing across the board of, I guess, in general, across Logan, at the inspections, are there still multiple applications on the first inspection, or people putting for applications without even seeing the property, just because they wanted to make sure they secure the property as quickly as they can?
There's a lot going on there, so I'll stick to that question as best I can.
No problem.
The amount of applications per property. So in January this year, we were, and I'll just preface this with the sales market went up and it's starting to balance. The rentals are just still going that way.
Yep.
So we haven't had the same effect at all. There is still a huge supply constriction. So we're still it's just getting more and more. January this year, we had on average 35 applications per week per property. We're probably up to about 50 now.
50, so it's gone even up from 35 in January to 50 now in August.
Yeah, and properties are generally renting within a week to 2 weeks, same as before. It's hard. That particular number is hard to reduce even further because a lot of the online application platforms are really, really painful for people to use. So even when you've got good applications, couple of days to drag the references and the right documentation out of everyone. So every now and then you get lucky and someone's application comes through beautifully, but a lot of the times we're stuck in the administrative dramas of using the platforms we have available to us. But definitely higher and higher volume of applicants. Anything under 400 a week, no matter what sort of area, quality, has just gone berserk. We had a property at 375 a week in Goodna, which, based on the comparables in the area, was a little higher than what the comparables showed, and we're finding that going above, RP data and its data lag. We're finding making an educated guess above what the CMA suggests it's worth is where you'll get your result. We had 172 applications in 3 weeks on that house, and to be honest, the only reason it took 3 weeks is that we got stuck trying to do viewings. Because of the tenant being sick and she's injured her back and etc. 172 applications. That's
crazy.
Also worth mentioning too that out of those we only found 3 that we were really happy with. And the owner actually came back and said, "Hey, look, is there something? Have you got anyone else?" Bearing in mind too that because there are so many people applying too, that the owner's standards at the moment are higher. We used to pride ourselves on processing every application start to finish. If you were a young couple, you presented beautifully, you had no rental history, but you had savings, good job, we'd identify that, and generally they end up making really good tenants. A lot of other agents wouldn't. At the moment, because of the massive workload of applications, generally anyone that doesn't have rental history, great income, has their application filled out well, won't get noticed.
Yeah, it's just such a competitive market, but you're talking about 172 applications for one property alone.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's only 3 good applications out of that figure. Is that the norm, or
on paper ticks all of the traditional boxes? Because 172 groups of people would have made terrible tenants, because that's
I was going to say.
when you're looking at those sort of traditional, do you have long, good rental history? Do you have strong affordability and established jobs? All of those things that everyone considers a perfect applicant. Do you have a reasonable number of pets? Are there, a family of 4 or 5 to suit the size of the house? There were only 3 there that fit all those criteria. It's a little bit abnormal. We generally, when I mentioned, 50 applicants on average per property, that's to find 2 or 3 that you're happy with. So I think our average ratio at the moment is 3 excellent applications per roughly 50. I think it's worth keeping in mind too that excellent applicants will only apply for a few properties before they're approved for something, even in this super competitive market. And funnily enough, most of those people don't realize that they're excellent applicants either. So they're panicking as much as everyone else. The other people, where you might have been an applicant who's got good rental history but struggled over COVID, got a couple of notice to remedy breaches a couple of years ago, in a previous market, you'd be approved for maybe one of your first 5 properties you applied for anyway, because you're otherwise still a great applicant. In the current market, your couple of notice to remedies are going to put you up against someone who's similarly great but doesn't have those notice to remedies, and you're going to more than likely keep missing out as a result. So those people who are good but not excellent are finding themselves really struggling. And I've had a few of my tenants who've been that way. They've been good tenants, but they didn't pay their rent once or twice, or the yard was a mess or something, and they're really struggling to find somewhere, which has been amazing. I start calling the agents and saying, why, these guys are great. Those sorts of people are struggling. So you end up with a huge proportion of people who are applying over and over and over again. So when we're getting 50 applicants per property, the majority of those people have probably applied for 50 properties, whereas a few years ago they would have only applied for a few. So you've got that perspective, even though there is, too little supply and too much demand, the sheer volume of the applications is also because so many people are applying for so many more properties. So you sort of over-representation of those less excellent applications.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, interesting. Okay, so basically what you're saying is, there seems to be like any prospective tenant will just keep on putting through applications because they keep on failing and didn't get the property. So that's why, this seems to like a probable one that we can go with. Let's put it in. Here's another one. Here's another one. So you get a lot of repetitive applicants, I should say, which are good but not excellent. And unfortunately, because they are not excellent, and when you had 2 or 3 excellent tenants, those seem to be the preferred option from a landlord perspective, especially when in a current market when there's so much demand for good properties. Absolutely. Isn't it?
So much competition.
Wow.
The online application platforms make it easy for people to apply for multiple properties too, so that really adds to the workload there.
Yeah. Are you seeing at the moment there's a bidding war in terms of the applications?
Oh, this is a good question. I guess I have to be careful how we answer you as the applicants. So people will come to us and say, can I offer more? And people can offer more, but we can't encourage them to. We can't ask them to. There's quite strict rules. I think in Victoria you were allowed to encourage bidding up until the Daniel Andrews amendments. I don't think you've ever been allowed to do it in Queensland, but tenant, let's say one tenant offers $20 a week extra, you can't go back to the other applicant and say, hey, you should offer more.
Gotcha.
It's a bit of a shame. On one hand, it's a bit of a shame for the person who didn't offer more, but it's to stop you sort of driving the price up. Hey, you should offer 20 more. Let's try another 20 from you, and so on and so forth. And the way people are quite desperate at the moment, you probably end up there to get some ridiculous bidding situations going on. So I dare say it's for the best that we're not allowed to do that. I don't know how comfortable I'd be if we were, but we're getting a lot of people offering extra. Obviously not creating a bidding situation. Yeah. Because none of them are aware of what anyone else has offered. But in 2-3 years ago, you would probably have 1 in 100 people offer extra rent. And generally, when people offered extra rent, there was a reason for it, and it was usually an applicant who you weren't comfortable with. People who've got questionable sources of income, offering extra, paying cash, tinfoiling all the windows and thing.
Isn't that a typical Logan setup?
Look, I've never put one in.
Not you, Tom, not you.
The warning signs are there. But these days, I'd say 1 in 5 people we're approving are offering extra. A lot of people who are offering extra are really good quality tenants. I don't think in the last year anyone we've offered extra has given us any problems at all. They've all been really, really gorgeous people. So that's, I guess that just comes down to people's desperation. I dare say in some cases, a lot of the people who've offered extra would have got it anyway. But in other cases, we do have those 2 or 3 excellent applicants. One of them offered extra. We're happy with all of them. They're all moving in the same time. That's the thing that got them the house.
Interesting.
So,
okay. Yeah, right.
It's definitely happening substantially more than I've ever come across it before. And also, people might have used to offer $5 or $10 a week extra. We had someone recently offer $50 a week extra, and we approved them. They were the best applicants. They were gorgeous. So that's, the amount is a lot too.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's definitely. I think the rent is catching up now, which is good. And the prices are probably starting to pull back a little bit, which means sooner or later, I think the yield is going to go back up again, right? So, and that's going to make it attractive again for property investors looking at doing the due diligence. And it's good to get assurance from you that they can't do Dutch bidding. From that perspective, you can't just go back and say, hey, David just offered $20 more. Do you want to bump it up? And what's your best offer? Because I know, that, I don't know, maybe some Sydney sales agents might do that, unfortunately. Anyway, they shouldn't be allowed to now. So, good. Okay. No, that's really interesting. Thanks for the information there. I do want to kind of wrap it up with a bit of the latest goss around the Queensland land tax changes. I don't even know how we start with this one. Can you give our listeners a bit of background in terms of what's being passed? Because I think it's already been passed from memory, right? It's already legislated.
I'm not sure if it's in effect yet, but I know it's happened. It's a thing.
I think it will start next year. So July 2023 is when it starts to kick in. But it's already like you said, it's already affected. But yeah, could you actually give us a bit of an outset in terms of what the actual land tax changes is?
I guess my understanding is that the government, every state controls its own land tax and has its own thresholds, and they're all a little bit different. I think in Queensland it was land value of $500,000, which for most people is on your third investment property in a cheaper area, you'd start paying land tax. Maybe if you're in Brisbane, like Indooroopilly, etc., it could have been on your second. They changed it so that they'll also consider properties you own in other states. I feel to a point it's a little bit of double dipping, and they're not necessarily saying you have $600,000 of land in Brisbane and $300,000 of land in Sydney, so you're going to be land taxed on $900,000. It's not quite that simple, but definitely I think the idea was to stop investors spreading their eggs in various states to avoid paying land tax. I guess to a point it makes sense, but I have a large proportion of clients who have properties in multiple states, and they're all very, very cranky. This is a double whammy because the land values obviously in Queensland have gone up dramatically. So a lot of my clients, with or without properties interstate, have started paying land tax or are paying more land tax recently as a result of increased UCVs. And then they're going to get hit by having properties interstate as well. So I guess where land tax might have previously have been a bit of a niche tax that you only talked about if you were lucky enough to have a pile of investment properties, it's becoming a bigger expense, and it can be a really large proportion of the outgoings now as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way the way the property investors calling is like cash grab from Queensland government, right? Essentially, that's what it is. It's a simple tweak in the legislation, and all of a sudden now, you're liable to include all the other land values that you have across Australia to be counted for the threshold, right? The land tax threshold in Queensland, land tax threshold too. I guess but I think ultimately there is another portion which so for example how they do it is my understanding as well, and again I need to caveat this because both you and me are not qualified accountants in this area, so this is just us talking as property investors to investors. My understanding of it is, yeah, so you need to include all the other land values that you have interstate, compared against the Queensland land tax threshold, but then you take the portion of the Queensland land value out of the total percentage. So, for example, you got 1 mil out of 1.5 mil of Queensland properties. So, in other words, 1 mil in Queensland, 1.5 mil altogether. And that's 66.7%. So you only pay 66 or 67% of that value, of that land tax, essentially. So, but still, that adds a lot of money, outgoings, right? And that's just with such a simple tweak. I wonder whether other state governments, after seeing Queensland doing this, they might start introducing it as well. You never know. But Tom, I guess my thoughts initially when I saw this is there's going to be a massive pullback of investors buying up in Queensland. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the investors who've got, let's say, 3 or more properties. Are most likely to be discouraged from continuing to buy. I think if the investment is lucrative enough that it stacks up regardless, they're probably just going to buy anyway. But it definitely makes the feasibility a little difficult. So that's I don't know what sort of extent of pullback there'll be, but certainly the majority of my clients are probably the target audience for these changes. And that would be something that that would seriously affect their considering buying another property here. I guess if you're Sydney based, you've got your principal place of residence in Sydney, maybe one investment property down there, you've got 1 or 2 properties up here, and you're looking at buying something else priced out of Sydney. Still, you're probably going to go and look at Adelaide instead of Queensland. So yeah. I think, especially while there's other markets that are showing a bit of promise now too, they're more likely to look elsewhere. Western Australia is looking really positive now. So I guess it's just another strategy to bring Queensland off the boil, I suppose.
But funny enough, because I mean the way I understand it, and you could correct me if my thinking is wrong here, Tom. Ultimately, property investing is all about. It's like a business. We got to treat it like a business, right? If the property is not going to be able to make a profit, because in the long term, we need to make sure we make a profit, not just from a capital growth perspective, but a lot of people invest in Queensland for yield perspective, like what you were mentioning before. What do you think are the likelihood that people would start passing, not directly saying, here's a land tax, I'm going to increase the rent now, but instead pushing continuously to push the rent up in order to partially mitigate this additional land tax costs that they have to hold? Do you think that's going to be feasible, or is that likely or not unlikely?
I watched a long and spirited discussion recently about this between some other property investors. I feel like, and there were some good points made on all sides, the long-term prices get passed on one way or another, but we're talking long term, not sort of in one cycle. I don't think investors can't say, because my property costs me more, you have to pay more rent. I know that some investors do feel that way. They might have felt previously that they'll leave the property under market because they appreciate the tenants, they didn't need it to go up, and now they're going and saying our rates are going up, and so now we need more rent. I think that's a really flawed argument, because the easiest way to challenge it is to say, when the rates went down, did you reduce the rent? No one did that. Ultimately, the cost of holding the property is mostly divorced from the supply and demand that creates the market rent. Obviously, to a point, when someone's looking at buying or selling, they're going to do their feasibility. If the property is worth, if it's too much to buy, the interest rate's too high, the holding costs are too high, and the rent hasn't caught up, then they're probably just not going to buy that property, which effectively, with the reduced demand, would reduce the value of the property to the point where it would make sense to buy. So I think maybe in the shorter term, it's likely to make the values of the properties lower. I think it's hard to create a direct correlation between my holding costs have gone up, so now you have to pay more, because that's not how the system works. For me, I don't care what my clients' holding costs are, whether they've paid the mortgage off or what financial position they're in. Every time a lease renewal comes up, we discuss reverting to market rent. And then the decision on exactly what rent is achieved is based around all the million little characteristics there. But, that never does the question come up, how are your holding costs going?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. That's good. I guess that hopefully gives a bit of assurances to the Queensland tenants who, unfortunately, who's currently in this unfortunate position of having to pay a higher rent and not even necessarily be able to get a place to rent too. So, Tom, I think one last question as well. Just my understanding, if I'm not sure whether this is going to work or not. So this land tax changes. It's already legislated. It's already in place at the moment. Now, I think there's another state election, Queensland state election next year. Is that correct? Or the year after?
I should know that, and I don't.
Now, okay, so putting that aside, has there been in the past instance where these type of legislation get retracted, because of, say, for example, the other party comes in and say, well, that doesn't make sense. We actually need more property investors to be investing in Queensland because we're already short of housing at the moment. So let's cancel this stupid legislation and let's get the investors to come invest money in Sunshine State again. Has it happened before? And what do you think?
It probably has happened before. I guess generally in politics, governments are a little bit allergic to removing taxes. Okay. I suppose that's not always the case, particularly with the Liberals. And that's probably a big point there too, Liberal versus Labor. If with a Liberal government, we're probably, there's a possibility of that being reversed. Or I think possibly more likely than it being reversed is for it to be some other incentive put in place. But I suppose it would have to get to a point where the market had cooled and someone had identified that, hey, we need more investors. And then someone in government would go through that process of how do we attract more investors and possibly changing that land tax legislation could be part of their decision. I suppose that they may be able to use it as some sort of a weapon as well, but I think it hasn't been terribly well politicized. I haven't seen that on the news, so I think to use it as a bit of a media tool is unlikely.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So let's see how that goes. I mean, obviously the investor part of me inside me is kind of say, well, let's hope that there's some changes and, this is not going to stay very long because ultimately Queensland's still a great place to be investing in as from a property investment perspective, right? And you don't want to ruin the opportunity just because of this stupid additional land tax that's costing people to having a second thought about should I be buying in Queensland or not? So.
Yeah, once the values stabilise, I think we'll have a lot more people more comfortable to redo their feasibility. Basically, there's a bit of volatility right now. We've got first world countries all over the planet trying to rein in their inflation. We've got sort of global economic wars going on. We still have this really weird restricted supply situation driving the inflation, which is really interesting, but it basically just creates this volatility and a lack of market confidence. And as that settles down, the interest rates hit their target point, the people calm down and stop spending, I think there'll still be plenty of time in Queensland before, say, the Olympics happen, and I think that's likely to continue driving economic growth. So I'd like to think that we're in sort of quite a temporary little lull here, and Queensland over the next decade will continue to be a really desirable area to invest.
No, nice one, Tom. Okay, all right, thank you. Any final thoughts on rentals, or any tips for the property investor landlords, I guess, at the moment?
One cheeky one that I didn't put in earlier, which was really odd. The rents in Logan are doing substantially better than the rents in Brisbane.
Okay.
So the proportionate increases are much higher in Logan. I have no idea why. Within a week of each other, we rented two comparable houses, one in Eden's Landing and one in Upper Mount Gravatt, and you wouldn't believe the interest in the Eden's Landing property. Eden's Landing's lovely, but Upper Mount Gravatt is a great spot. It's 15 minutes from the city, and it's quieter. So those people that are sort of looking at Logan, and I guess to a point Ipswich too, we've had the majority of the business in Logan, and saying, oh, the yields aren't so good anymore. The growth here and the interest in the area is wild. I've never seen anything like it. And traditionally, you get more interest in the city and less as it works its way out. Right now, the regionals are just on fire. As far as rents go, may not stack up the same way it did before from a yield point of view, but I think they definitely still make a really good investment.
Yeah.
And the supply issue doesn't have any, it doesn't seem to be calming down anytime soon either, which is a bit of a disaster from a social, as a social issue, but certainly as an investor, if you are looking at buying, it's a what do you want to call it, like a positive point to likely continued rent growth.
Yeah, no, it's good point. Yeah, and like we mentioned, I think the price correction will probably continue for a bit longer. So it's going to pull back, and the rental yield is going to become promising again. And then it's going to start attracting property investors back looking into it. Who said Logan cannot have capital growth? Here you go. He is capital growth, right? He is living proof.
In the last 2 years, done on a whole 30%. Some of them have doubled, particularly the lower end of the market. You've got properties you might have paid $275 for now, 500 plus, 550. So that's exciting. And I think once it pulls back and it stabilizes, we'll continue to grow. Probably not at the same trajectory,
not at the same rate,
but definitely continued growth is likely.
Yeah. Good. All right. I think that sums up pretty well in terms of what property investors should be thinking now. and they probably should know who to talk to now if they need to look for a property manager too, don't they, Tom?
Appreciated.
All right, mate. Well, thank you for your time and your generosity in terms of the on-the-ground information today. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. Again, none of this is financial advice or accounting advice, particularly today when we talk about land tax. If you want to get more information on these, please do get specific advice from your accountants or qualified professionals before making a decision. But otherwise, we will see you guys again in another episode of Spark Your F.I.R.E. Tom and David, see ya.